let's finally have some fun. We're going to start over here in our starter asset palette. If you know a particular model or material or something that you're looking for, you can use the search bar right here. You also have the option to filter by 4 different things. So the starter asset palette has a lot of stuff in it. Right now, we're just going to deal with the models, which is the first icon here. But it also includes materials, lighting options, and images. So you can sort them depending on the asset that you want to use by clicking on these icons. Our model palette has 2 types of models. It has basic shapes, and then it also has another section called models, and the 2 are very different. The reason that they're broken out into 2 parts is because of the way that they behave. If we look a little closer at the shapes over here, we can see the ones on the top have this additional icon down in the lower right-hand corner. This just means that they have additional properties that we can customize, whereas these items down in this section do not. Now, these are not the only basic shapes that we have to build things from scratch. If we start to slide down our models, we can see near the bottom of the starter assets, we have a bunch of other geometric shapes that we can use. So if you're building something from scratch like you would in Tinkercad and you need a specific shape, those options are available down here, but these ones are not as customizable as the ones that are at the top. So what am I talking about when I'm saying they're customizable? Well, let's start with the sphere. I'm going to click on the sphere and drag one out to my stage. I can see that the last widget that I used was my V key, so that's why this came up this way. So where do I find the settings for these sliders? They're over here in your properties panel. These first 4 properties are going to be the same on every model because these are the same thing as your RS, E, and V keys. So we can put a specific position in on the stage. If we want to rotate the object a very specific number, maybe you're trying to align two objects in a 45-degree angle together, you can use this instead of trying to eyeball it with your hula hoops. The same thing with scale and size. If you need a very specific size, you can come in here and punch it in by the numbers. This is really helpful whenever you're designing something that, say, you want a 3D print and you don't want it to be massively huge. You can check the size here to see how big it's going to be in real life. Now, underneath these options is where you will find the specific properties of that model. The sphere is pretty simple. It only has 3 options under type. So standard sphere is going to be nice and smooth. But we also have the option of turning it into a hexahedron or a octahedron, and then we can also go in and change our subdivisions. So we can change the look of the sphere, kind of box it up a little bit. We also have the option to change the radius, which basically just scales the sphere. So let's take a look at a different model. I'm going to pull a cylinder out onto the stage. Now, I'm not worried about position, rotation, scale, or size because I know I can change that either here with my widget or I can type in my numbers. But as I slide down, I can see that this cylinder has some additional options. I can change my radius, I can change the height. I can also change the number of sides. So 48 sides gives this cylinder a nice round look, but if I brought this number down, I can start to see how it changes the model. So I can customize it from a smooth cylinder to maybe a prism if I wanted to. But it also has an additional item here called Bevel. I'm going to click the little arrow to spin it open, and I'm going to turn this switch on. Now what this is going to do, Bevel, is it's going to round the edge of the model. And now I have this cool looking smooth edge. These settings are also customizable, so if I start to play with it, I can get more of a sphere or maybe a slightly rounded edge here. And I can also change the number of sides on the bevel. This is gonna be a little bit harder to see. There we go. So one side on the bevel, two sides. It's kind of chiseling it away until I keep chiseling until it's nice and smooth. So about 18 sides makes that bevel nice and smooth. I can also come down here to slice, and I can see now I'm taking a chunk out of my cylinder. So maybe if I took this small chunk here and brought my height down, it looks kind of like a slice of cheese or a hunk of cheese or maybe a cake with a piece taken out of it. If I switch the angle the other direction, now I have the piece of cake or the piece of cheese. So you can see how these different properties enable you to make new shapes out of these basic shapes. So let's take a look at text. I'm going to click and drag that out onto the stage. And it's a little hard to see, so this is a good use of my pan tool. I'm going to hit the number 2 and move this over, and I'm going to dolly out either by using the 3 key or using the scrolly wheel on my mouse. And then I'll use the 1 key, our orbit key, to turn around and kind of get a better look at my text. I'm going back to the pan key to move this over just a little bit. So when I select my text and I come over here to my properties, I have all of my basic 4. And then, oh my gosh, I have so many different ways to customize this text, starting with what it says. So it automatically kicks out some lorem ipsum, but I'm going to put something different here. So I can type in whatever text I want. That's pretty cool. Okay, and then I can actually change the font. I also have the option of bold or italicize. So all of the font options that come with the font will be here for you to customize as well. The kerning, the leading, aligning to the left, center, or right. I can change the size of the font. I can change the depth of how much I want this font to kind of stick out in 3D. So that's pretty cool too. But then I have even more options. Let's click on this one more time to bring up the properties, and I'm gonna slide down, and I have the option to bevel here as well, but I have more than one type of bevel. I can use a classic bevel, or I could use rounded edges. I can have it chiseled out with a convex bevel. I can have it step out, classic outline. So you see we have all kinds of options here. I'm gonna go back to the rounded edges for now. And then you have even more sliders here to customize and change the look of your font. So play around with this section, play around with your fonts until you feel comfortable with it. So let's take a look at one last model. We're gonna come down to our actual models. And for now, let's just grab a beverage can. So maybe I need this in the middle of my stage. Right now it's kind of off-centered. I don't know where my center of my stage is. So I'm just going to zero this out by clicking on X and Y and Z and making sure they're all at 0. I'm going to use my pan tool to come over. Now I know it's in the dead center of my stage. I'm going to use my dolly tool to zoom in. A little more pan, a little more dolly, a little more pan. There we go. Now when I click on this item, notice I don't have a lot of properties. All I can do is change the position, the rotation, the scale, and the size. There's nothing else I can do with this model like I can with the models underneath basic shapes. Now that doesn't mean I can't do some cool stuff with these models, it just means they're not as versatile as your basic shapes are. Now I want you to start paying attention to a second palette. Right now we've been working in our starter assets. Now we're paying attention to our properties. I guess technically it's your third palette. I want you to pay attention to what's going on in the scene because underneath our beverage can, we have 2 models. It's actually 2 models put together. We have a pull ring and a can. I'm going to use my orbit tool to kind of spin around here so you can see this model is made up of 2 parts. If I click on pull ring, I can see that this model is actually its own freestanding model. So if I use my move tool on just the pull ring, I can now pull that pull ring up and I can see it's separate from the can. So that's something else you want to pay attention to whenever you start working with models. If they come in your scene as a folder, then they're probably in several parts. Sometimes this can cause problems, sometimes this can be helpful. It just depends on what you're trying to do with the model. But I want you to start paying attention to that. If it's not a basic shape and you're pulling from these models down here, or if you're bringing a model in from a different source, maybe you downloaded one that you want to bring into Dimension, you definitely want to start paying attention to what's going on up here. We'll talk more about this later on as we start to add materials, but I just want you to kind of see what's going on here. So now it's time to play. I want you to take some time to pull some of these shapes out onto your stage. Like maybe take a couple cubes and try to stack them on top of each other. This is where it's really important that you start using your pan and your orbit tools, because if I orbit around, I can see, oh, yep, I definitely missed. So I'll click on it, try to move it on top, orbit around a little more. I'm gonna have to dolly out, maybe pan a little bit so I have room to pull up the next one. Let's see if I can get him to stack right on top. First try. Oh, I'm gonna orbit around. Oh, I really missed there. After a while, you'll get better at aligning your shapes without having to orbit around them all the time. In the beginning, sometimes in one direction it looks like they're all lined up, but when you orbit around, you'll realize, oh my goodness, they are really not. It's really kind of wonky. So you need to practice this part before we move on. So just take some time here to really get to know your models. Pull them out, play with their properties, check out your regular models, see what additional items they have when you in your scene. Maybe try stacking a couple of different models to create something new. And if you get frustrated as you're moving around the plane, just stop and remember 1, 2, and 3. Because that's the hardest part when you're getting started, is just trying to reorient yourself on your plane. So just remember 1 to orbit around it, 2 to pan, and 3 to zoom in and out, which is dollying. Remember, you're in control, not the models. With a little practice, you'll get the hang of it in no time.